Alright, so my name's Ben. I'm going to be talking to you this afternoon. I really want to talk about the Cambridge Mee balls, but to start things off I just need to give you a few minutes on some legal principle to set things up. So, contribution between wrongdoers. That's basically what I'm doing my thesis on, and we can explain it in a fairly simple way. So, imagine we've got a car accident where defendant one, our negligent driver, has run a red light and hit the victim's car, causing some damage to it. Now, we also know that we've got a negligent mechanic who serviced the victim's brakes pretty badly a few days before. And if he'd done his job properly, the victim would have been able to stop in time, we would have had no damage. So we've got a situation where two defendants are liable in respect of the same damage. Now, to explain what contribution is, basically the law says that the victim can choose his defendant. He can sue one or both of the drivers and recover the full amount from one of them. So, in this example, let's say that the victim decides to sue the driver. There's been a certain amount of damage, he recovers that amount from the driver by way of compensation, and the driver's pretty unhappy about that because he's had to foot the entire bill and the mechanic hasn't paid anything. So, to fix this up, we have a secondary action called contribution, which is where the driver is able to sue the mechanic and basically claim some amount of contribution that we say is a just and equitable amount. So, the result is that they share the burden. Now, where things get slightly more interesting, at least for me, is a situation where we've got a gain. So, in a car crash, no one wins. There's loss, there's damage, but in other cases, people actually benefit from engaging in unlawful conduct. So, a really good example of this is price fixing, so cartels. People actually profit from doing something unlawful. Now, if we take the same sort of approach, if one defendant pays the whole amount over to the victim, we end up with a result where one defendant is out of pocket to a certain extent, they're stripped of their gains, but they've also paid more, and the other defendant has a corresponding windfall that otherwise they might be entitled to hang on to. So, to correct this, we might allow contribution to make sure that gain goes across, and we've got a neat situation where everyone ends up back where they started. Right, contribution. So 3 issues I want to try and touch on today, maybe 2 depending on time. First one, if we're looking at something that's a legal wrong but also a moral wrong, something that's reprehensible or naughty in the eyes of the law, should we have these contribution actions at all? So one argument is that as long as the victim gets compensated for what's happened, we shouldn't use up court time and resources at all on making these fine adjustments between people who've done something wrong in the first place. The second question, what happens if one of the defendants is insolvent, unavailable, or for whatever reason can't be sued? You might get a judgment against them, but you can't actually enforce it, and that might change the situation a little bit. And then the final thing, do we care about relative blameworthiness? In 2 circumstances. One, if the gains are enough to meet the entire burden, maybe it doesn't matter, we just apply the gains to meet that loss, and everyone's back to square. Alright, on to the fun stuff, Mee balls. Now, I have to stress, this is all hypothetical, so any assertions I might pass on individuals or organisations, please disregard. Alright, so fast forward to July this year. You'll be pleased to know, sun's shining in Cambridge, the days are long, exams are over, and of course Jesus has done absolutely brilliantly academically. You'll also be happy to know that the Mee balls are a raging success. Homerton's June event, the Jesus Mee ball and the St John's Mee ball have all sold out. Generally went pretty well, but on the academic side, all of the other colleges had absolutely abysmal results. And as a result, they all decided they will cancel their 2015 Mee balls. Now, the St John's Mee ball president just sees an opportunity here and decides to call a meeting with her counterparts at Jesus and St John's. So they meet in secret. Now, the presidents come to an agreement. They decide that for 2015 balls, they are each going to do 3 things. They will jack up the prices per ticket by £100, they will maintain the per head expenditure from 2014, and they will sell 10,000 tickets to each ball. So the idea is that each will pocket a £1 million gain. The ticket purchasers, as a collective, will have overpaid £3 million compared to what's a fair price without this cartel. Now, foolproof, right? Things don't always go according to plan. So, unfortunately, Homerton can't convince people to pay £160 for a ticket for their event, and in the result, they don't sell a single ticket. But Jesus and John's, the plan goes off without a hitch for now. They sell all 10,000 tickets, But unfortunately, as often happens, word gets out, the tab runs a savage expose on the whole sorry saga, and the ticket purchasers are outraged. So they get together and they decide that they're going to sue Homerton for the whole amount. Now, there are various reasons why you might just sue one college, but one example would be if Johns and Jesus had used separate companies, independent companies, to run the balls with limited resources, whereas Homerton might have the college's backing behind it and therefore deeper pockets to sue. So, as a result, £2 million overpaid, £1 million held by each of these Mayball committees at Jesus and Johns. Homerton foots the full bill, pays £2 million over, our ticket purchases are back to square, and Jesus and John's Mayball committees are each holding a £1 million gain. So first question, moral turpitude. These parties have entered into a deliberate arrangement which is clearly unlawful. They're trying to price fix, and one argument is that this should bar Homerton from getting any contribution whatsoever. The victims are being compensated and we should just let the loss lie where it falls. The counter-argument, or the strongest one, is that, well, the Jesus and John's committees have also engaged in wrongdoing, and if we leave things as they are, they're going to have a windfall. So the fair result might be that we allow £1 million of contribution to each, but I'll come back to this later on. Second scenario, slight twist in the facts. So things go as before, no tickets to Homerton, 10,000 to each of the others, but there's a small hiccup at the Johns ball. Now, the Johns committee decided it would be a great idea to pull out a little known but priceless piece of the St John's art collection, the dinosaur. Now, it's wildly popular, but unfortunately there's a freak accident. It burns down, and there's a little bit of collateral damage. So, the Johns committee decide that they might want to leave fairly quickly, so they pack up their profits, they book a flight out of the country, and they're never to be seen again. So we've got a different situation now. The Johns Mayball Committee and that £1 million benefit can't be found. We can't access it at all. So the gain and the loss don't match up anymore. £2 million here, £1 million gain left. Homerton pays across, same. And our issue is what we do with unavailable gains. So the Johns gains are as good as gone. No one knows where they are, and for all practical purposes, we're not getting them back. So what's Homerton entitled to recover? Assuming we're not barring them completely on that first issue, we've got a couple of choices. We might say, well, we don't want someone to retain a windfall, so we'll require Jesus to pay over £1 million, but we'll just leave it there. Second option is to say, well, that still leaves Homerton £1 million out of pocket, so maybe we should pay over an additional £500,000 and leave it so that they are equally sharing the actual burden of loss, and the ticket purchases are back to square. Alright, third and final scenario. Same deal. Dinosaur, still happened, fire, savage. But one more fact comes to light. And we probably expected this all along. The Jesus Mayball Committee was quite reluctant to go along with this in the first place. Homerton and St John's were actually the ringleaders and the architects of the cartel. And the Jesus Mayball president only agreed under some pretty extreme pressure. She was stressed about her exams and just wanted it out of the way. We also find some evidence that Homerton and St John's Mayball committees have been attempting a cartel for many years, but because of the number of colleges in Cambridge, it's been quite hard. So, does this change anything? It's a pretty similar analysis to our second situation, but there might be a stronger case to have this result here. We still don't want people engaging in unlawful conduct to hold on to their gains, but in this situation, the more blameworthy party ends up footing the real loss. And Jesus is stripped of the unlawful gains, but doesn't go any further. Or you might say, well, we don't really want the court to have to make these sorts of assessments, we'll just split it even. Now, I know you're probably thinking, how am I actually writing an LLM thesis on this? The calls don't really have that much to do with it, but with contribution law, it's all quite uncertain, especially when it comes to gains. Now, basically, I think the main reason for this is that probably an overwhelming amount of the cases that have been decided in the 20th century were things like motor accidents. The law isn't used to having to deal with gains. Classically, two people are responsible for causing some damage, and we need to look at things like blame and relative causative potency to work out how we split that burden. But when you've got a gain involved, it's a bit different, and the recent cases are starting to develop this a bit. So, just to turn back on our three questions. Moral turpitude. England and Australia, not entirely clear, but there's probably no theoretical bar. We're not just going to say, bad luck, everything lies where it falls. But in the US, there's been a deliberate policy decision that in the case of cartels, you cannot get contribution. So there is no recovery in those circumstances. Their argument from an economic perspective is that if everyone ends up back at square one, there's absolutely no deterrent from doing it in the first place. So the question becomes, well, are these actions really how we're trying to punish these things, or do we use other mechanisms to do that? Second question, which is kind of a bit closer to my heart, is the question of when we decide what the fair share of liability is. Now, the current English academic approach that's emerging in the literature is this idea that there's some, before the event, primary and secondary liability that we can just point to. And we can say, okay, a fair share on the facts that we've had is that Homerton ultimately foots no bill. Jesus and John's at each foot 1 million of the bill. Now, that works fine when you've got corresponding gains and losses on each side, but when something happens like the dinosaur saga and John's are completely unavailable, it leaves you with quite a rigid result where you can't actually adjust it based on what's happened. So I'm arguing more for what we might call a classical approach, because it actually came up in some quite early 19th century cases before these complications came in. We look after the event at, well, what's really happened? How is the real burden distributed, taking into account the gains and being required to give them up isn't really a loss. And we say, well, what's fair? So the advantage of that is flexibility, but it's also slightly uncertain. Then the final thing, blameworthiness. First, should it override gains at all? And it's related to the last point. So my view that I'm trying to put is a person who meets a so-called burden of liability out of money that they've only made because they've done something unlawful isn't really bearing a true burden at all. You got something you shouldn't have, you're required to give it up. That's not really a loss. So as a first rule, we shouldn't really look at blameworthiness. We should look at applying retained gains to meet that liability. And then as a second step, where there's a shortfall, absolutely we look at blameworthiness. We want some flexibility and we need to make a bit of a judgment about what's fair. So that's about it in simple terms. Are there any questions? Generally, the rule is absolutely no. The one carve out to that is in the US, part of the, so as I said, you can't get it at all in the US, but part of the current reform proposals, they don't just look at where the gains have gone, they also look at market share for cartels. So it's not so much about how much money they've got, but if you engage in a cartel and you've got an 80% share of the market, that's going to tend towards more liability on your end. Even if you don't make that much out of the particular arrangement, if you've got a bigger market share in a market that you're affecting, you will be required to foot more of the bill if there's a shortfall. But generally, their wealth doesn't come into it at all, unless they're insolvent, in which case you need to shift it on to someone else. Anyone else?
What about the situation where the victims aren't in a position to sort of sue for the complete gains of the unlawful parties? So what seems to be quite common is you get people who will, in some manner, take money off a large number of people, and not all of those people make it to court to get.
Yeah, absolutely. So class actions are a big part of getting around that. There's effectively a representative group. I think a good example of one was recently. The libel stuff that's going through now might end up with one of those, but you get a representative group and you put out an